The sun hadn't yet burned the morning chill off the prairie when Luella arrived at the edge of the auction yard. Her limp dragging slightly more than usual after 4 days of travel. Dust clung to her boots, her hem, her skin, and she clutched the small canvas bag to her chest like it might disappear. Inside were the last of her father's hidden savings, coins he'd stashed beneath the floorboards and never told anyone about. Not even her mother. She had one goal: buy a husband. Not for love, not even for companionship. Luella needed someone to help plant crops, fix the cabin roof, carry water from the well when her ankle wouldn't let her. She wasn't here for dreams. She was here to survive. So she stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, a cluster of men in weathered hats and worn vests. Rough hands gripping cigarillos and jugs of watered-down whiskey. Her dress was plain, her face taut from days without sleep. And no one paid her any attention until the caller shouted, "Lot 17. All eyes turned toward the center, where 2 men dragged something forward and dropped it with a dusty thud. A large burlap sack, tied tight at the top. Luella's brow furrowed. This was supposed to be a man, strong-backed, debt-free, willing to marry and stay silent about the details. That was the promise, the price, the agreement. But a sack? The crowd laughed and hooted as the bidding began. Luella felt her pulse beat louder than the caller's voice. Her hand lifted once, just once, and the world spun faster than she could follow. Sold, the caller barked, slapping his clipboard. The sack was hers. She stepped forward on instinct, ignoring the pain in her ankle. The crowd parted, murmuring and smirking. One man muttered, "Hope she likes him quiet." Another howled, "Better check he's still breathing." Luella knelt slowly, hands trembling. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers slick with sweat. The rope slipped free, and the fabric sagged open. Then she froze. Inside, bundled in an oversized, sweat-stained shirt, wasn't a man at all. It was a baby. A girl. Tiny. Pink. Cheeks flushed from the heat. A dark crescent-shaped birthmark pressed against her temple like the mark of a forgotten moon. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The crowd burst into laughter, as if someone had just played the best joke of the season. "Guess she overpaid," someone shouted. "Maybe it'll cry less than a husband would." Luella didn't move. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her ribs. Her eyes darted around the ring, at the men grinning. The auctioneer already calling the next lot. The handlers carrying off an old mule with more ceremony than the child had received. No one stopped. No one explained. No one claimed a mistake. Luella was alone with a sack and a child someone had packaged like livestock. The baby shifted, a soft murmur escaping her lips. Her tiny fingers reached up in the air blindly, then settled against Luella's chest like they had every right to be there. Luella's legs wanted to collapse. Her mind raced, but her arms didn't let go. Not even when the auctioneer gave her a half-pitying shrug and turned away. Not even when a splinter jabbed her knee. She stood up slowly, the baby tucked tightly against her, the empty sack dangling from one hand. Her lips parted, the first words she'd spoken aloud in days slipping through dry air. "It's okay," she whispered, and the baby sighed, just a soft, content exhale, and fell asleep again. Luella didn't know what to do. She hadn't come for this. She'd come for someone to build a life with, not someone who was a life. As she limped back toward the narrow trail leading out of town, she couldn't feel her arms. The weight of the child was both featherlight and overwhelming. At the cabin she'd borrowed from a kind widow, she laid the baby on a folded quilt and searched the sack again. No bottle, no cloth, just the faint smell of sweat and wood smoke. Then her fingers brushed something thin. A note, scrawled in charcoal pencil on sweat-stained paper. "Her name is Mercy. I couldn't do it. If you found her, please give her a chance." No signature, no explanation, just a name, and a plea. Luella sank onto the floor beside the quilt. Her back met the wall, the wood cool against her spine. The baby, Mercy, blinked up at her, eyes unfocused, uncertain, but calm. "Mercy," she whispered again, tasting the word. It felt too delicate for something this brutal, too soft for something so jarring. But the baby didn't care. She grabbed Luella's finger with surprising strength and held on. Luella looked down at her hands, calloused and cracked. now cradling a soul she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to protect. But her hands didn't shake anymore. She wasn't ready. She wasn't equipped. She wasn't sure if she even wanted this. But for now, the baby was warm, and she was fed. For now, Luella was the only world Mercy had. And somehow, that was enough to keep her standing. She would figure it out tomorrow. Tonight, she would hold the child close and listen to the sound of her breathing, steady and fragile, and let it be the answer to a question she hadn't meant to ask. The knock came just after dawn. Quiet but firm. Luella froze mid-step, one hand clutching a spoon, the other still warm from Mercy's tiny body nestled against her chest. The baby had only just fallen asleep, her breath steady and her fingers curled in the folds of Luella's shawl. No one ever came to the cabin this early. No one came at all. Really, not this far down the rutted trail where grass grew tall and the wind forgot to blow. Luella stepped to the door, heart hammering, feet bare on the creaking floorboards. She pulled it open slowly, careful not to shift the sleeping infant. A man stood on the porch. Tall, gaunt, and weathered by the kind of life that didn't offer softness. His boots were caked in dried mud, his coat threadbare at the elbows. And his eyes were what stopped her cold. He didn't smile, didn't even offer a polite nod. Just looked at her, then at the child in her arms. "That sack," he said, voice gravel thick. "Did you open it?" Luella didn't answer. She didn't have to. His gaze had already found Mercy, now stirring slightly in her sleep. As if sensing the weight of someone she didn't know pressing in on her dreams. The man exhaled hard. "Once. I was told she'd be taken far. That no one would know." His voice was tight, not angry, but something close to pleading. Luella's arms tightened around the baby. "And who told you that?" He shifted his weight, eyes flicking down to the floor. "Her mother," he said quietly, "but not her father. Me." Silence stretched between them, brittle and cold. Luella stared at him, really stared this time. He looked like the kind of man who'd wrestle wild horses and never flinch at blood. But there was something behind his posture. A rawness in the way he held his hat against his chest like a funeral mourner. That made her pause. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said she wouldn't live. That she was cursed. Born during the lightning storm, when it split the steeple in half. My wife, she believed it. She looked at that baby and saw doom." Luella said nothing. She just held Mercy tighter. "I didn't believe it," the man went on, "but I didn't stop her either. I wasn't strong enough." And there it was, not a demand, not a claim, but a confession, the kind made not to gain sympathy, but because it had grown too heavy to carry alone. "She cried so hard that night," he added, "louder than any child I ever heard. And my wife she turned away. Said the child brought the storm. Said a woman shouldn't scream like that giving birth. But it wasn't the storm that cursed her. It was us, her parents, too blind, too weak." Luella felt her own breath hitch. He wasn't asking for her back. He wasn't trying to rewrite what had already been written. He just wanted to know. "She's fed," Luella said after a long moment. "She's warm." That's more than she had that day. The man nodded slowly. "Then I won't come again." He looked at Mercy one last time. "I just needed to see her with my own eyes. Needed to know she lived." And then he turned, descended the porch, and walked back down the trail, boots silent in the morning mist. 2 days passed. Luella tried not to think about him, tried to return to her quiet rhythms, warming milk over the fire, humming lullabies that came from somewhere deep in her bones, gently rocking Mercy to sleep while the wind rustled the trees. But she couldn't shake the look in that man's eyes. A look of a man who had held regret so long. It had become the only thing he could offer. On the third morning, she found it. A letter. Folded, unsealed, tucked beneath a small flat stone on the cabin steps. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike, like someone who hadn't written much in his life but needed to be understood. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. I'm not even asking you to believe I tried. But if that little girl is still breathing, if she's warm and fed, it's because you did what I couldn't. Asterisk. My wife's gone now. Buried her last spring. She never let go of the hate. Said no child should wail the way Mercy did. Said it was unnatural. But it wasn't the storm that cursed her. It was us. Too proud to ask for help. Too full of fear to love something we didn't understand. I kept thinking of that sack. How I handed her off without looking. Like she was weight, not life. If she ever asks, don't tell her I was cruel. Tell her I was weak. And if there's anything in me worth forgiveness, it's in that sack you opened. She's more than I ever was. Asterisk. Luella sat at the table, the letter open in trembling hands. Mercy dozed nearby, tiny breaths rising and falling against her chest. She wanted to be angry, to scream at the paper, to crumple it and throw it in the fire. But all she could feel was the ache behind every line, the shame between each word, the quiet truth of a man trying, too late, to name his own failure. She folded the letter and tucked it into the old tin where she kept buttons and seeds, where things too fragile for fire could still be kept safe. She wouldn't show it to Mercy. Not now, maybe not ever. But part of her was grateful he had written. Not for herself, but for Mercy. Because one day, when she asked who she was and where she came from, Luella could say honestly, "Your father was a man who broke. But he tried to make it right." She leaned down and kissed Mercy's temple, whispering through the lump in her throat, "You are not cursed. You are chosen." And in that quiet moment, as the wind stirred the trees outside and the fire warmed the cabin floor, Luella felt something shift. Mercy was no longer a burden handed to her in a sack. She was hers, a child born in pain, held in compassion, and kept in love. The snow had just begun to melt when he appeared. Luella had taken Mercy into town for the first time in weeks. Wrapped tightly in a wool shawl and tucked against her chest. The trip had been short, just to trade eggs and maybe a few dried herbs, but she felt every eye in the general store as she stepped inside. People no longer whispered with the same venom, but silence still trailed her like a shadow. She was halfway down the porch steps when she saw him, leaning against a post outside the trading station. Boots dusty, coat worn thin, a hat hanging from his hand. He wasn't old, barely more than 20, but his eyes carried years. And those eyes were locked on Mercy, not with suspicion or greed, but with something softer, something aching. Luella's step slowed. He stood up straighter, gaze flicking to her. "Ma'am," he said, voice low. "Her name's Mercy?" Luella shifted Mercy against her shoulder, saying nothing. "I think," he hesitated. "I think she's my sister." She stared at him, the quiet noise of the town fading. Then she laughed, sharp, defensive, bitter. "Nice try," she said. "If you want coin, keep walking." But the young man didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sketch, edges softened by time. It was drawn in charcoal, rough but tender, showing the face of a woman. A face Luella didn't recognize, until Mercy reached out with one small hand and touched the paper like it was something familiar. "My mother drew that," the man said. "Her name was Eden Furlow. She died at Red Hill Quarantine Station. She was pregnant when we left Georgia. Running from everything, fever. Men. Memory. They told me the baby didn't make it. That she was too small. That she died screaming." Luella didn't want to believe him. Couldn't. Because if he was telling the truth, it meant Mercy had a family. A bloodline. A history Luella didn't know. And her place in Mercy's life, that fragile thing she'd built, felt suddenly uncertain. But Mercy was watching him. Her wide, solemn eyes stared, not afraid, just curious. Luella sat slowly on the edge of the porch, breath shallow. "The man who gave me that sack never looked at me," she whispered, just dropped it and said, "She's what's left." Jonas nodded, his throat working like the words hurt. He meant the baby, my sister. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for Mercy. He just sat too, on the bottom step beside Luella, like someone not there to take, but to bear witness. "She looks safe," he said quietly. "She is," Luella replied. "She eats like a farmhand and laughs when I whistle. She curls her fingers around mine like it means something." Jonas blinked fast, nodding once. "She doesn't know you," Luella added, her voice firm. "You'll have to earn her." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said, no hesitation. 2 mornings later, he was gone. Luella stepped outside to find the frost melting from the porch rail. Mercy was warm on her hip, humming sleepily as birds began their early songs. At her feet, beneath the doorframe, was an envelope. It wasn't sealed with wax, just a simple fold. Heavy paper. No name written on it. Inside was a deed. Signed, sealed, notarized. To the cabin she'd been borrowing. To the half-acre of land it sat on. To a modest trust fund tied to the furlough name. The note beside it was short. Jonas's handwriting. Steady but unpolished. For the woman who saved my sister. And gave her more than I ever could. Luella read it 3 times. Her fingers trembling, she sank to her knees on the porch floor. The boards cool beneath her. Mercy gurgled softly in her arms, pressing a tiny hand to Luella's cheek like she could feel the storm inside her stilling. No one had ever given her land. Not her father, not the town, not any man who promised more than he delivered. But now she held in her hands a home. A real home, one with her name on the deed and Mercy's laughter in the walls. She didn't cry, not then. She just sat quietly, the letter in one hand, Mercy in the other, and let the truth wash over her like spring sunlight. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rooted. That evening, she walked the perimeter of the land with Mercy in her shawl and the deed folded in her apron. The air smelled of thawing earth and faint wood smoke. In the distance, the trees swayed gently, whispering secrets through their bare branches. She traced the corners of the fence posts, her fingers running over the worn wood. Not perfect, not large, but hers, hers. The wind lifted the edges of Mercy's blanket, and the child stirred, murmuring in sleep. Luella kissed her forehead and whispered, "You've got a place now. Mercy June, not just a name, not just a mother, a place to belong." And with that, Luella returned to the cabin, her steps slow and steady, the door closing softly behind them. In the months to follow, neighbors who once only watched began to wave. One woman brought a pie, another left firewood. Slowly, without fanfare, the town seemed to shift. But none of it mattered more than the deed she kept in the drawer beside the bed. Not because of what it bought, but because of what it meant. That someone had seen what she'd done, not just kept a child, but chose her. And that was the kind of gratitude that didn't need to be spoken. Only lived. At first, the silence in town had been worse than the words. When Luella walked into the general store that day, Mercy tucked close to her chest in a sling. Every conversation ground to a halt. Chairs scraped, jars clinked. The wooden floorboards echoed beneath her boots like they resented her footsteps. She'd expected whispers, but she hadn't expected how loud the silence would feel. Mrs. Kelton behind the counter narrowed her eyes. "You're the one with the baby," she said flatly, as if accusing Luella of a crime. Luella didn't flinch. She set down a small crate of eggs, her spine straight. "Yes," she replied, "I'm the one." From the back of the store, a man near the flour barrels muttered, "Paid full price for a husband and got a screaming sack instead." Someone else chuckled. Another added, "At least this one won't talk back." Luella didn't look at them, didn't give them the satisfaction of her shame. But inside, something sank, heavy and hollow. She'd come for flour and needles. That was all. She didn't owe them explanations. But the air pressed thick against her chest. Then a soft voice broke through. "Is she all right?" Luella turned. It was the storekeeper's wife, the younger woman with gentle eyes and trembling hands. She wasn't much older than Luella herself. Maybe 25, with a soft braid down her back and kindness in the way she looked at Mercy. Luella nodded. "She's more than all right. She eats like a ranch hand and dreams like a saint." The younger woman smiled, hesitant but sincere. Mrs. Kelton snorted from behind the counter. "Don't come begging sympathy when that girl grows up without a name and no father." Luella didn't blink. "Names come later," she said coolly. "Dignity comes first." And then, slowly, she unwrapped part of the sling just enough to show Mercy's face, peaceful, rosy-cheeked. One tiny fist curled tight against Luella's collarbone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man near the barrel scoffed. "Looks like trouble waiting to happen." Luella turned, gaze steady. "Then I suppose you'd know what trouble looks like." She picked up her sack of flour, turned on her heel, and walked out into the morning sun. That night, someone knocked on her door. She froze. Mercy was already asleep in the cradle by the hearth, her breath soft, tiny fingers twitching as if dreaming. Luella crossed the room quietly and opened the door a crack. The storekeeper's wife stood outside, holding a small bag of dried apples and a folded blue blanket in her arms. "I had one once," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. "A daughter. Lost her before the first snow." Luella didn't know what to say. Words stuck like thorns in her throat. "If you ever need anything," the woman added, eyes downcast. "I'm just past the creek bend." She offered the bag. Luella took it slowly, nodding. "Thank you. Would you like some tea?" she asked after a pause. The woman blinked, surprised. "Yes," she said softly, "I'd like that." That was the first kindness. The next came 2 days later, a bundle of fresh turnips left at the edge of her porch. No note, just carefully wrapped in muslin. Then a stack of firewood, neatly piled beside the shed. Then a jar of honey, still sealed. None of the townsfolk said anything. No one came knocking with speeches or apologies. But something had shifted. Slowly, awkwardly, they began to reach instead of recoil. When Luella walked down the dirt road with Mercy in her arms, old Mr. Thatch, who hadn't said a word to her since the auction, tipped his hat and muttered, "Brave woman." She nearly tripped. At the chapel the following Sunday, she entered expecting to be ignored. But the pastor simply nodded toward the front pew. No one moved to block her way. She sat down. Mercy stirred, and for the first time in weeks, Luella felt something uncoil in her chest. Not trust yet, but hope. Neighbors who had only stared before now began to offer more than silence. The seamstress brought a scrap of blue fabric embroidered with tiny yellow flowers. "For Mercy," she said awkwardly, as if she didn't know how to give kindness without apologizing for it. A widower from 3 farms over dropped off a bag of oats and didn't say a word. Just nodded once and left. And the storekeeper's wife? She came by often now. Sometimes with herbs, sometimes with extra diapers, sometimes just to hold the baby and sit quietly by the fire while Luella shelled peas or mended a hem. In a town where reputation was currency, Luella had arrived with nothing but a limp and a child wrapped in a mystery. But she had stayed. She had loved that child with everything she had. And it was beginning to change people. One afternoon, Luella stood outside with Mercy on her hip, watching the sun sink behind the hill. She looked out across the land Jonas had given her, the garden now half turned, the porch repaired, the world a little more hers each day. A year ago, no one would have let her stay. A month ago, no one would have called her neighbor. And yet here she was, with a child who cooed when she sang. A garden that sprouted green through thawed soil. And people who had once laughed now reaching out in halting, human ways. Luella kissed Mercy's curls and whispered, "We're not alone anymore." And she meant it, because the town hadn't changed overnight. It might never change completely. But it had started, not with grand gestures, not with speeches or confessions. Just with small kindnesses offered like seeds, quiet, unassuming, and full of life. And Luella, once a woman mocked for daring to love a child not born of her blood, had become a symbol not of scandal, but of strength. They called the town meeting the following Sunday. Officially, it was about auction protocol and charity funds. But everyone in Carson Ridge knew why they were really there. Word had spread. About the girl with the birthmark. About the woman who outbid every man at the auction. About the baby in the burlap sack. The father who never came back. And the brother who gave her land. About how the town had changed, not all at once, but just enough. Luella sat in the back row of the chapel. Mercy wrapped snug in the blue shawl someone had gifted them, asleep against her chest. The room was warm from the low afternoon sun, streaming through the cracked windows and gilding the floorboards in gold. She hadn't planned to speak. She had come out of respect, not for recognition. All she wanted was to sit quietly, to blend into the wooden walls, and listen. But when the pastor stood behind the podium and asked gently, "Does anyone wish to say something about what happened last Sunday?" all heads turned toward her. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It wasn't the mocking hush she'd once known. It was something more like waiting. Expectation wrapped in respect. Luella didn't move at first. Her heart pounded. Mercy stirred slightly in her arms. Then the baby's fingers curled around her pinky. That same old silent question. "Can we do this?" Luella stood. She limped slowly to the front of the chapel. The floor creaked beneath her boots. and the weight of mercy against her chest felt heavier than usual, but not in a way that hurt. More like an anchor, a reason. She didn't climb the dais, just stood on the floor below it, meeting the eyes of the people who had once looked past her, or laughed, or turned away. Now they looked directly at her. Some with guilt, some with curiosity, a few with awe. She cleared her throat, voice quiet but firm. I came to that auction because I didn't think I had any other choice. No one interrupted. I didn't come for pity. Or for charity. I came for help. For a man who'd share the burden. I gave every coin I had. And I got a sack. There were a few uncomfortable shifts in the pews. But still no one spoke. I thought I'd been cheated. I thought maybe God was laughing. But when I opened that sack and saw her, Mercy, I didn't see a curse. I saw someone just as lost as I was. She looked down at the child sleeping peacefully. Then back up. She cried that first night until her voice cracked. And I cried too, because I didn't know how to be what she needed. But I knew I couldn't let her go. Luella took a breath. You all thought I was foolish. Maybe you still do. You laughed when I named her mine. But you didn't hear her in the dark. You didn't feel the way her hand held mine like it meant something. You didn't see her eyes follow the light like it was the only thing worth believing in. A woman in the third pew sniffled softly. Luella continued. You think being a mother means blood. But I think it means staying when it's hard. Loving when it hurts. Choosing someone when there's nothing in it for you but the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'll grow up never feeling abandoned. She paused. I didn't save her, she said. She saved me. There was no applause. It wasn't that kind of speech. But the silence after it was different. Heavy with truth. Full of weight and warmth. And then the mayor, who hadn't said a word in all the years she'd lived in town, stood. We've made mistakes, he said plainly, but the town sees you now, Miss Luella, and we won't look away again. She didn't cry until she got home. She set Mercy in her cradle by the fire and sat down at the kitchen table with the letter from Jonas. The deed, and the town's quiet acknowledgement still ringing in her ears. She pressed a hand to her chest and let herself feel it, not just relief. Not just gratitude, pride, because she hadn't just been tolerated. She'd been recognized, not for surviving, but for choosing love when no one expected her to. That night, someone left a basket of biscuits on the porch. Another neighbor dropped off milk. Someone else stacked more firewood beside the door. But what mattered most was the next time she went into town. People didn't look away. They nodded. Some smiled. And when she passed the chapel again, she saw her name, Luella May Carter, handwritten on a sign outside with the words donations now being accepted for the child named Mercy. Mercy was still just a baby. She didn't understand the way things had changed. She didn't know how people had once laughed, or how they now whispered kindness when they thought no one heard. But Luella knew, and every time Mercy reached for her, every time she woke up with a sleepy smile, every time her tiny hand searched blindly for her mother's warmth, Luella remembered the girl she had been when she first stepped into that auction. Lonely, determined, desperate to matter. She had walked into town trying to disappear beneath a man's name. But she had walked out carrying a life, and earning her own name in full. As she watched the firelight flicker across Mercy's face, Luella leaned close and whispered, "They'll never laugh again." And she didn't mean it as vengeance. She meant it as truth. Because Mercy, this girl wrapped in mystery and moonlight and love, was no longer the weight Luella carried. She was the reason Luella stood taller. And that made all the difference.